Hello, friends. Welcome to our Snyk Live show of the day. Super excited to be here with you, live streaming from my house in the Bay Area of California. It's pretty early here. Hopefully, you're all having a really nice day out there. So today, we're going to be talking about the Log4shell vulnerability that's on the top of everyone's mind. And we have a few amazing guests today. I will go through in short order and introduce them. They're all Java champions. And so we thought it'd be really fun to get some experts in the Java development world to come on and help talk about, what is the Log4shell vulnerability? It's been absolutely top of mind for the last just about 7 full days now since it was publicly disclosed. Secondly, what do you need to know about it in order to make sure that all of your applications and company projects and everything like that are secure? And then third, what are things we can actually do to take positive steps to not only solve this particular issue, but just improve the state of security in the Java community in particular, just overall. So without further ado, let me introduce you to our amazing guests. Let's start. Oh, there we go. All of them are on screen. Awesome. Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you. So here's what we'll do. Let's go through. I'll ask each of you to quickly introduce yourself, talk a little bit about what you do, and then maybe let's also get a fun fact about you in there as well so that our audience can get to know you a bit more. So let's start with Anna. Anna, please take it away.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Happy to be here with you today and hope you'll enjoy what we're going to talk about and inspire you to some actions. So I'm Anna. I'm currently working as a developer advocate for Red Hat Java Champion, as Randall has mentioned earlier, and certified architect. Pretty much preoccupied about solving complex scenarios regarding Java world and cloud providers and Kubernetes and all these stuff. So I'm pretty much looking at the big picture and complex big pictures. So looking forward for the talk and passing the mic to the next guest.
We definitely need the fun fact, though. Come on.
The fun fact.
The most important part.
Well, since we were talking about Christmas and eating a lot earlier, I cannot wait for Christmas and eat a lot for Christmas. So that's a fun fact.
Okay. That works. We'll count that. All right. Martijn, excuse me. Let's hear a little bit more about your background.
Hi, everyone. So I'm the principal group manager for Java at Microsoft. Yes, Microsoft does Java. My group runs, we create our own build of OpenJDK and do performance tooling for Java and do a lot of outreach in the community and things. What else could I say? I helped put together Adopter OpenJDK, now known as Eclipse Adoptium, and I run the London Java user group. And fun fact for me is about 9 years ago, I think I stood up on stage and said I'd eat my hat if I ever worked for the evil corporation Microsoft. And guess what? 2 years ago, my company got acquired and I'm working for Microsoft very happily.
Did you eat the hat, though? Is that the fun fact you're trying to share right now?
There are photos of me like chewing on one of these red beanies.
Okay. All right. Well, I hope it didn't mess up your stomach too bad, I guess. And finally, last but not least, Brian.
All right. Hey, I'm Brian Demers. I'm a developer advocate at Okta. I'm also a committer on a few Apache projects. So Apache Maven, which I'm sure we'll talk about shortly. And I'm also the PMC chair on Apache Shiro, which is a security project. During my, the day job, I spent a lot of time dealing with OAuth and a lot of like application type security related concerns. What else? Oh, fun fact. So I always use this fun fact, but I'm a hobby beekeeper. So I have some bees in my backyard, and they're starting to get cold this time of year, but hopefully they'll make it through the winter.
Awesome. Also, I have to say on public stream, I'm a little angry at Brian because we've been friends forever now. It feels like I've never had any of your homemade honey, man. What's up with that?
Oh,
so I'm calling you out publicly.
Yeah, the last couple of years have been rough, but I'll get you some. Don't worry.
All right. Awesome. Well, again, thank you everyone for being here. This is a super important topic. To get into it real quick, just in case anyone's watching the stream, by the way, quick disclosure for any of our listeners, if you have any questions for our panelists, please drop them into chat on Twitch or YouTube Live. I will relay them to our guests and make sure that they get asked. All right. So feel free to engage. But anyways, going back to the topic at hand real quick, why don't we start out by doing a quick high-level introduction to what the Log4shell vulnerability is, just in case anyone watching has no idea what the heck we're talking about. Martijn, why don't you just give everyone a quick high-level description of what Log4shell is?
Cool. I'll do my level best. So in Java, there are lots of popular logging libraries, and in particular, one of those logging libraries is called Log4j. The particular vulnerability is in Log4j 2 of a particular version range. 2.10.0 through to 2.15.0 is deemed to be vulnerable. And what Log4j allows you to do, and has done for a very long time, this vulnerability has actually been out there for quite some time, is to allow you to effectively do remote logging to remote machines, which may not seem like an unreasonable thing to go and do. However, the mechanism that you can use to do lookups of those remote machines, which is through a API called the Java Naming Directory Interface, or JNDI for short, the way that Log4j has implemented that in those vulnerable versions allowed users to string substitute the URL of the lookup they were doing with anything they darn well pleased. And as you can imagine, if you've ever put on your not so white hat in a security sense, that allows you to insert all sorts of interesting remote code executions, especially using JNDI to go and redirect that logging request to an evil server somewhere, which in turn then executes some sort of a payload. So I won't go into too much more detail than that. I don't really want to encourage folks to go race off and try this. But that is in effect what happened. It was basically no sanitation of string input into a lookup that allows you to do more. Hopefully I got that right. Brian and Anna, please correct me if I missed anything there.
I think that's a good overview.
It's a very good overview. We can.
I was going to say,
yeah.
Really quick follow-up question. I'm sorry. Maybe Anna, you could address this, but I'm not a Java developer. I'm the only person on this call that is not a Java champion. I'm more of a Python/security person in general. But when I first heard about the Log4shell vulnerability, one of the things I found really interesting is the Jindy string injection, sort of like remote code execution, like lookup capabilities in general. And the first thing I thought of, which I'm sure a lot of our audience is wondering, is why would a logging library ever want to download compiled like Java bytecode and be able to run it? Like, what is the Jindy part of this vulnerability, and why is that baked into this library in the first place? Anyone able to talk about that?
I can take a stab at it. So I think there's two separate concerns, right? So there's the remote code execution bits that you can do once you connect older versions of Java. They connect to an LDAP server, and then they download some bytes and execute them, right? So I don't know why you'd want to do that nowadays. Like, I don't know, when I started, I think there was a lot of RMI, and this was a very popular technique to do these things. Now, I think that's sort of fallen out of favor, but I think that's separate, right? And then there's the Log4j issue, which you can do the lookups, right? But of course, you have these two separate issues, and you put them together, and you create a big problem.
And to complete on this, according to what I've read into the issue, the functionality was kept for some backwards compatibility as well. Because when you're like having such a library with this historic and this spread, you have to pay attention to your end users, which are everybody, I think, who's using those applications that are built on this, and have to make sure that they don't break their things when they're upgrading. So this is pretty much why that was kept, like also for backwards compatibility, which is very important when upgrading applications. And
that makes a lot of sense. Maybe another question, just as an outsider, but this vulnerability seems to be extremely widespread. Like, everything reported in the tech press is basically saying that, like, everyone from Microsoft to the smallest of startups that are using basically any sort of Java software are impacted by this. And that's why it's been such a big deal. And all of us have probably been working insane hours over the last 7 days. maybe you could briefly talk about like how widespread is the usage of the Log4j library in the Java ecosystem, and then what are people doing for logging right now?
Well, I think that I don't have exactly some numbers at this moment. I've seen some numbers the past days, and it was really scary. However, there is a thing called like, well, if you're using it, you're potentially impacted. The thing is that until you're being hit, you're kind of safe. But you need to like look into upgrading, because you have to be better safe than sorry later, and like to risk your chances. So pretty much everybody who has been, so the world has propagated the news mostly for making us aware that, hey, you might have a problem. Look into this and take some action. Like, think about this, because it's probability for your application to be affected. And I think it's better to like say and cry that there's a problem publicly to the world, and let everybody know and propagate this news, instead of like waiting and seeing the numbers and thinking like, oh. So then that's one of the things that we should like think it's better that actually the library is open sourced, because the community can contribute to this, but also you can mitigate the issues way faster thanks to the community action. So there are also some very good pluses to the situation from my point of view.
So another quick question as well. Obviously, Log4j is extremely used in a lot of different places. I thought one of the things you said, Anna, was really interesting. Is like, obviously a lot of places use it. How do you know if you're actually being impacted by it? I think one interesting discussion topic as well might be, essentially at the end of the day, this vulnerability is like an injection vulnerability. Because if you format a string a particular way, you can trick the logging library into running some arbitrary code that you or someone else has created, right? And because it's a logging library, it might be interesting to just briefly talk about like the way you actually trigger this vulnerability, right? Is to get the logging library to log one of these lines with this injected string in it. And I think that's another interesting part to this, which is, it's obviously really difficult, in my opinion, as a non-Java developer, to take a look at your code base when you have thousands or millions of lines of code potentially at larger companies and say, hey, we're using this logging library like in a lot of places. Where is any sort of like user injectable possible string coming from? Like, that seems like a very difficult task, So obviously not everyone's going to be impacted by this because they're not logging strings that could have injectable things in them. But what do you think is, or what would you say for someone who is using this library today in a vulnerable version? Maybe they're using a version of it less than 2.15.0 or something, let's say. Like, what is some actionable immediate advice that you would want to give to them so they can start getting on top of this situation?
I think people need to assume they're vulnerable if they have this version. It's like you mentioned, Randall. I think it's incredibly difficult to figure out if you have, some sort of user input logged, right? Now, there's logging frameworks, like if you're using an HTTP client, like those things log. Whatever your transitive app, dependencies are, those things are logging. So you got to assume that you're logging things you're not aware of. I know that's not, I can't guarantee that, right? But I think the only safe bet is to assume that you're vulnerable and those things are logged. So then you have to do some sort of mitigation. So updating, I think, is the quickest and easiest path for everybody. But
yeah, it's way easier than to start searching in your many applications where you're logging user input.
So let's talk about that. What are the steps to remediation? There's been a lot of information coming out over the last week. The situation has changed pretty dramatically. So maybe we'll go through it step by step. So Martijn, let's say you're using a version of Log4j that's 2. something. Like, what should you do today to like get rid of this problem for your applications?
Yeah, the very best thing you can do is to replace it with 2.16.0 and restart your application. That is by far and away the best thing you can do. And that's definitely what we at Microsoft are recommending to everybody. It is the permanent fix. A lot of the other solutions out there, which are great for live running systems that you feel you can't reboot just yet, or that you may not have access to be able to replace that third party, the Log4j library. There is a property you can set, for example, or you could use, some sort of Java agent technique to do some bytecode, or even to remove the JNDI lookup class or set a property. And there's quite a few solutions out there. I won't enumerate them all, but they all tend to be very temporary solutions. And as soon as you restart your server, that solution is null and void again, right? And so we recommend that people do take the extra, sometimes painful step of making sure they go and upgrade for sure. So I'll just start with that one strong bit of advice, and I'll let Brian and Anna go into some of the other workarounds.
I think there's some potential infrastructure issues too. Like if you're bringing on new folks to your infrastructure team, these temporary solutions are just that, right? They're temporary, and if somebody else misses your README to forget to run that Java agent or apply this patch, you're still going to be vulnerable, and you're not going to know, and these things are going to come up again, in a month or whatever, because we're going to see these types of attacks for the foreseeable future.
Well, I'm more positive about propagating changes. So I definitely believe that upgrading is one of the best things to do. But I also do trust the folks that are working on the operational side, DevOps engineers and so on, and especially security engineers that are looking also into infrastructure, that they are taking care, especially about the containerized applications, and they're having the good basis of security set up there regarding security contexts and all these other stuff that involve running containers, and not everything is run as root, and everything can be executed inside the container and create things. And because I do want to believe that people are looking into these practices as well. And one thing that probably some of the people are thinking when they have these pipelines together with the infrastructure is how fast they can propagate changes to the actual impacted environment. I think that was the criticality around this. The entire situation, like how fast can we give a solution and how fast you can implement it. This is why there's so many ranges of solutions and so many blogs around what you can do, because it's important to find the solution and also put it in practice very fast. One thing that I would like to mention also for the Java developers to have in mind is that GNDI exploits have been there for some time. It's not exactly the first time that happens. So having an eye on security as a developer is definitely very important. And secondly, using different ways of testing your security. In some cases, for example, especially for logging, I think that there are use cases for penetration tests to ensure that you are setting the right permissions for the log files and for what is being logged. And this is from my memory speaking. So it involves actually an entire village to work on making an application secure.
So let's talk about that remediation for one moment. One of the things you said, Martijn, a few minutes ago is that if you're using any 2.x version of Log4j, the best advice right now is to upgrade to release 2.16.0 or above. One of the things that happened is, this was sort of publicly hit the news cycle, let's say, last Friday. And immediately there was a 2.15.0 release that came out. We've had a few commenters in the chat. It looks like Micah and Simon both brought this up. But, one of the questions is originally a week ago, the advice was to upgrade to 2.15.0. And then a couple of days ago, there was some new news about that release. What was that news, and what should people be aware of if they did do an upgrade to 2.15.0 a few days ago and are now wondering why we're saying 2.16.0? Like what changed essentially?
There's actually some further late breaking news on that as well. So so security researchers, and this is what almost always happens in these situations. So for folks who have had to do their round of patching, it's the first time you've had to do this in your career, always be aware that you'll almost always end up patching twice in these situations, because when people are patching a zero-day exploit, they're usually putting in the fastest, sanest fix they can think of at the time. But then when the whole world of security researchers start taking a really hard look at things, there's almost inevitably, an edge case that they've missed. So the edge case initially that they thought was vulnerable was, although the initial patch blocked the ability to remote code execute, it didn't stop the ability to basically spam that JNDI lookup, for lack of a more detailed technical explanation. So it meant that even 2.15 was vulnerable to a DOS attack effectively. So you could still swarm that logging line and cause people's applications to halt or freeze. As of yesterday, they've actually gone and upgraded that. So another security researcher has confirmed that even that DOS vulnerability has now been upgraded back to an RCE. And so the CVSS score has actually gone from 3.7 back up to 9.0. And so that means, if you just spent the last 2 days patching to 2.15, I'm afraid to give you bad news, but you need to go to 2.16 as soon as possible.
I think the good news is, I think I saw on the Log4j dev list was the only thing that changed between those two versions, the 2.15 and 2.16, was removing the lookup functionality. So
Entirely, yep.
The rate of change is minimal. So if you did a whole bunch of testing, hopefully this should be a lot smoother.
Another question that has been coming up quite a bit is, a lot of places have been using Log4j for a while, and some companies, some applications are using like a 1.x release version of the library. I also saw some additional follow-up news saying, hey, by the way, if you're using Log4j 1.x, it doesn't mean you're safe. So what is the situation with people using an older 1.x release of the library, and what steps should they take right now to make sure that they're good?
I think that the 1.x support ended I saw something about it some time ago, so I'm speaking from my memories. It's ended in 2015. However, when teams are managing applications, they choose what they want to do with their apps. So you can choose to remain on something that's not necessarily supported anymore, it's not really looked into. However, regarding the vulnerability that was reported for the 1.x, is not that concerning the world, because you would need access to how was it called, the GMS appender, and you need to have some other setup. So it's pretty difficult to gain access to that to be able to actually do it. However, it's good to be aware of it in case you're still using 1.x, and look into your configurations so that, God forbid, you're actually doing those things. So it's good that it was found out and it was propagated and known to the world, so that everybody again can look into their configurations. And by the way, for those that are thinking that GMS appender and where would you use that and so on, back in the day, also speaking from memories, my memories, I used to do that. Yes, I used to do that. When you're trying to make your own pattern layout for the logs. So that's where you probably would have ended up using it a long time ago, hopefully, and not anymore. But yes, it's not as a big concern as the other one. However, it's good to be known and to be looked into. So it depends on what you're using, but officially 1.x, it's kind of saying please upgrade to the 2 point something for some time, since 2015.
So let's quickly go to some of the viewer comments. It looks like there's some interesting ones. So first of all, Micah left a comment a moment ago saying, if you're using SLF4j, I believe, you can plug into any logger, which will make it easier to upgrade or switch in the future. Could you all talk briefly to the audience about what that means?
Sure, I can take this one. So back in the day, at least when I started, Log4j was probably the OG, right? Like the original logging framework. And then there's a couple other, skipping over some history. There's a few other Java logging frameworks. So SLF4j is basically this simple abstraction layer on top of all of these. So you use the Log4j API or any of the logging APIs, and you route them all to the logging framework of your choice. So as Mike is mentioning, even if you're using the Log4j API jar, you can route them to some other logging appender like Logback, or I don't know, there's a couple other ones. So basically you can swap out the implementation, and then this problem kind of goes away.
Would you all recommend that any Java developer be using something like SLF4J then? Or is that something that's potentially unnecessary? Like, does that make it easier, for example, to like handle things like this if they crop up in the future? Just throwing that out there.
I'm a huge fan of SLF4J. I do a lot of like library development, so I think I've sort of biased opinion, because I think if your libraries are using SLF4J, the end application can pick whatever logging framework they want. I've been a fan of Logback, but that's more for there was a period of time where between Log4j 1 and 2 there was like a period of stagnation, so that seemed to be the way of things were going. But I don't know, I think it's all opinion based at this point.
Okay. Oh, go ahead, Anna.
So yes, I was going to say I agree with Brian on this one. Like it depends on everybody's choice, and recommending one or the other libraries is not. You cannot say that's a general solution for everybody to work on. And I'm most of the time thinking of the people that already use this and to their good work. So and also the fact that security vulnerabilities will always appear regardless of library. So just saying that, okay, now use something else because it looks safer, I don't think this is like a reasonable long-term solution. So all the time, it's better to like be aware that security vulnerabilities will appear. So regardless of the software, we're humans and we do make mistakes, all of us, but we can also fix them.
Some of us, like me, make mistakes a lot more than others potentially as well. So just throwing that out there. Martijn, let's. I have a question for you. So another one of our viewers, Matt, had a question in here. He basically said the 1.x CVE appears to require access to local configuration files in order to exploit. Should we consider issues that require that level of access to really be vulnerabilities? Maybe you could briefly talk about that.
Yeah, so Microsoft's policy on this, and I personally agree with it and always have in my security career, is that you operate on zero trust. And you should always assume that someone has got access to your configuration files, or someone's got access to that supposedly secure password file you've got on your secure machine behind your firewall, those sorts of things. So if you take a zero trust approach, then yes, you should still treat this as a vulnerability for sure.
Thanks. Maybe we could also go, it looks like Micah also had another comment. He said, fun fact, the original author of the Log4j 1.x library also created SLF4j and Logback. So, a few of you have mentioned Logback in here. For any Java developers that aren't familiar with it, what is Logback? Is it something that developers should potentially look into using? What is all of your opinions on that?
Yeah, there's fundamentally very little difference between Log4j2 and Logback, and as far as a developer and developer productivity, etc. is concerned. So it really becomes a matter of personal preference, I feel. Folks also forget that Java itself has Java util logging, right, built into Java. And I think sometimes people forget that they can, if they just are really genuinely doing some simple logging, then just go with what Java provides you. You don't have to have this third-party dependency added to your tree. But yeah, in essence, Logback's probably the second most popular logging library behind Log4j2. Who has more market share? I couldn't possibly, I wouldn't really know. Perhaps a scouring of Maven Central would tell us that, but not too sure.
Follow-up question. This is just from me, maybe a stupid question, but as Java champions and security professionals, what is your opinion on just using straight up system.out.println? Are people who are just printing all over the console just eons ahead of all of us in the security industry at the moment, or like what is the official word on the street in regards to that?
You just picked that from a meme or what, from a meme or what? There were some memes all over the internet about this. Come on, I mean, for years, I think in the professional world of Java developers, it was propagated to not use systemout.println unless we're doing hello worlds or we're learning Java. That's pretty much where we have used it. We rely on logging libraries and on logging professionally so that we can stream those logs further to either services that can use, can help us in debugging or identifying issues. There's a reason for everything when we're not using system.out.println, so that we can have a good holistic view of what's going on with our application. And unless you're like developing something that's for your own, for your own interest, and it looks like an application that you would like to play with. Otherwise, if somebody has been using system.out.println or any of these, it would be an interesting use case to see how things are and why did they choose this approach for a wider implementation.
Thank you. Go ahead, Martijn.
I have seen it used deliberately, and that's when people are actually using Java, which is fairly unusual in the grand scheme of things. But people who use Java to build command line utilities or who are building utility tools, and if you adhere to the Unix kind of principles of command line tools, and standard in, standard out, standard in is definitely the way to go. And I think when Java added JShell and the ability to effectively have a REPL, some Java developers have been comfortable with doing that. Outside of that, I would totally agree. System.out.println gives you no taxonomy, right? And as soon as you are writing a program of any significant scale, it quickly goes out the window. Plus, if you're running on containers and cloud and things, and if you're running a good secure container, which does not allow you to go and SSH in and look at a console, system.out effectively goes to, nowhere, unless you're streaming system out somewhere else.
Yeah, I know. That's another impact on using system.out.println, that in containerized applications, it's not handleable. Sorry for the invention of a new English word. That's pretty much what it's why we have been adhering to the standards for logging. You have a very good point, Martin. There is a purpose also for using system.out.println. My thoughts were more to the typical enterprise applications that are, distributed and big on platforms and so popular nowadays.
So I might be dumbing this down, but what I'm hearing across the group is that all Java champions are officially saying that system.out.println is more secure as a way to log. Am I misrepresenting this?
Don't do it.
Oh my.
I'm just joking. Please don't do that if you're watching this stream. We're just messing around.
No, I mean, but as we sort of talked about earlier too, even if your application uses just a print line, right? If you have some dependency on some library that uses something else, you're bringing in some of these logging frameworks, right? And those things are logging, so you're going to have to route that output somewhere. So you're sort of back in the I have to use a logging framework camp anyway.
Actually, I mean, to be fair, like I've built a lot of applications on platforms like, AWS and Heroku and things like that. One of the things I always sort of liked as a developer about those platforms is like, you can just sort of like print line stuff into the logs and they will use like a syslogd type streaming situation. And then you sort of filter it out based on the type of process that's outputting the logs. Like maybe you have like web process 1, web process 2, worker process 1, worker process 2, whatever. It's extremely like overly simplified, obviously, but there is maybe something to that, I would say, just as a developer, about having that level of flexibility. And even though it's very shoddy, it feels like maybe it's not the worst thing in the world all the time. I don't know, but yeah,
it's great for MVP, but I think the challenge you'll find is that there's no DSL, right? There's no domain-specific language or taxonomy, and so you, the engineer, have to hold all of that tagging and logging and labeling in your head, and sharing that system with your colleagues, right? And so as soon as you go beyond your toy application, it becomes pretty unmanageable.
So let's go to another viewer comment. Herman asked a question a little while ago. Sorry for being late on getting on top of this one, Herman, I believe. But the viewer asked, is the 2.15 release of Log4j vulnerable to remote code execution and not just denial of service? I think someone briefly mentioned this 10, 15 minutes back, but could one of you just sort of speak to this question?
Yes, it is. Go and upgrade.
Okay,
That's
great.
cool.
So the answer is yes. TLDR.
Yes.
Go upgrade to 2.16.0 or whatever future version it is by the time you watch this video is the official answer.
Yep.
Thanks for the question. Okay, great. So let's get into a slightly more complex topic. All of us were actually talking about this before the stream went live, so I think we should just continue the conversation. But let me quickly recap it for the audience. So let's say you're a Java developer, you're working on an application. You run a security scan, or maybe you just look through your dependencies, your direct dependencies in your application, and you realize, hey, I'm using the Log4j library, which means I need to upgrade. Whether I'm on like a 1.x release or a 2.x release, doesn't really matter. You just need to upgrade, right? So we've covered that. Now let's talk about the slightly more complicated topic of what happens if one of your dependencies has a dependency on a Log4j vulnerable version. Like, what do you do in the case of transitive dependencies? How do you handle them? How do you remediate it? Obviously, it's a much more complex topic, but what are all of your opinions on that subject? Maybe we'll start with Anna, and then I'll just sort of go around the group.
And I was saying, Martin, that he was preparing to like, I'm going to reply to this.
I'm going to go last. No, I'm very happy to go last on this.
Okay, so I'm going to start the conversation and saying, well, probably you might get that dependency because you're using some kind of library that is, well, using the affected Log4j. Of course, you can like either exclude that. I think there are plugins like Maven Enforcer to like help you in excluding that and adding the right one. However, you'd have to test if the new inclusion of the version is working. And you also have to look at the support that the framework or the library you're using for like doing this kind of replacements. So these are pretty much the things you need to think about when you're like trying to do this kind of replacements of dependencies inside of things that you were already using and were provided by somebody else, and they didn't get the chance to update. From what I've seen in the world, most of the libraries have been like really concerned on upgrading or like doing something about it. However, there might be cases when things are getting a little bit slower, or it takes a while to refactor the code. I mean, I think all of us have worked in applications where not always refactoring something or rewriting something is coming easy, and it impacts a lot of places. As cleaner the code we're like using, it can happen. So long story short, there are ways, but you need to be aware if like when you're trying to do these replacements and enforcers of the new version, if that is going to work in your context, and also if it's going to be supported by the initial library that was providing you the vulnerable Log4j one. And going to Martin because he's like preparing to give a good answer.
Brian, next, please.
All right. So there's transitive dependencies, I think, are like step number 2, and I think there's a few other things to talk about. But just scoping this to sort of typical dependency management. So Maven has a term, dependency management, and Gradle has a similar term. So you can upgrade basically one version of your dependencies, and anything that uses that will automatically get the new version. So in this case, you would say I'm dependent upon Log4j 2.16, and then that's the version you're going to get in your application. But as Anna said, like there are some potential compatibility issues. I don't know if there's any in the case of Log4j, but just in general, you have to be aware of that. So that's sort of the first pass along the way. It is important to note that just updating your transitive dependencies, so if you're using struts or something, you update struts, and that version of struts uses the newer version, you still might have some other dependency that uses the old version of Log4j, and depending on how your dependency resolution works, you may get a different version. So there are techniques in both Maven and Gradle to figure out what the tree looks like, and both Maven and Gradle resolve their dependencies differently. So Maven uses like a closest leaf, and I think Gradle uses a highest version, or I forget what it is, but they're slightly different. So just assume if you have one application built with Maven and one built with Gradle, like you may have to do something slightly different over there.
And Martijn, do you want to wrap us up here? What are your thoughts on dealing with these recursive dependencies on various older releases of Log4j?
Yeah, it's challenging. So again, the sort of strategic advice is you want to get upgraded to 2.16.0, right? And so, if it's a third party that's providing this Log4j, you want to go get that third party to do the upgrade for you. So if it's an open source project, chances are they've already done it in the past week. If it's a vendor, hopefully you've got a commercial contract with that vendor and they are doing their utmost to satisfy that commercial contract with you. And if not, you've got C-level execs who can go and give them a call over the phone. If for whatever reason that is not possible, then what Brian and Anna have suggested in terms of using your build tool to go and shade out the old versions, or to use a Maven Enforcer plugin to make sure that only 2.16 is the one loaded, is really, really advisable. Again, both Gradle and Maven will allow you to spit out the dependency tree before you go deploy your application. So you will have confirmation that you've actually gone and shaded out the correct thing. Please do be aware if you are deploying to any of the traditional Java enterprise application servers, WebLogic, WebSphere, JBoss, those sorts of things, make sure you check that those application servers are also not providing their own Log4j. And there's all sorts of fun parent class loader isolation tricks and stuff you may need to pull to make sure that you avoid those. So I think that would be my major advice. And I think, Brian, you probably wanted to cover off how it's not just transitive dependencies, how Log4j can sneak in. So I'll defer back to you because I know you had some fun thoughts here.
Yeah, so we used to do some dirty things, I think, in the Java world. And I think we did this sort of partially out of naivete, maybe, and partially just to get things done, right? So if I was going to package a library, I could take... And if I didn't want to have any dependencies that I had to pull in, I could take and put all my dependencies in my jar, right? So I would put Log4j, whatever, I know I just said stretch a minute ago, but whatever my dependencies are, I could put them in my jar. I could give my jar to you, and you would use that, right? So now from the outside looking in, it looks like, you're using, I don't know, my special lib.jar, right? And in a quick scan, it's like, oh, I don't have Log4j, but inside of that jar could be the Log4j class files, right? And then I could actually obfuscate all of that. So it wouldn't even look like, if you cracked open the jar, it wouldn't even look like Log4j. So there's a whole bunch of these odd edge cases that if you're doing anything that's using shaded or Uber jars, you should probably stop, right? This is one of my pet peeves of mine. The only valid reason for creating one of these things is an application developer shipping code to somebody, and I think there's better ways to do this, but that's, I think, the only valid way. If you're depending on somebody's code that includes other jars, that's wrong.
Essentially, what you're talking about is the concept of like static linking in a lot of other languages, right? You're like, hey, we're just going to build this massive binary with everything in there. Are there any tools you're aware of, though, that can take a look at those, let's say, images and scan it and say, hey, look, we know that this series of bytes is equivalent to like some Log4j vulnerable revision or something, like within this massive file? Like, are there tools like that exist that people can leverage in the event that they, for example, are using some old stuff, or maybe some of the people watching the stream are building like desktop applications they're shipping or whatever it is? Like, what are some things we can give, or some advice we can give to people in that situation?
I think Mike actually just put something in the chat, but I know the OWASP dependency scanning tool will check hashes of certain files. So to look at all the hashes of the files inside your jars. And Mike had just mentioned the Snyk tool, the Snyk CLI will scan bytecode. So there are definitely tools out there to help you. They're just more than sort of the initial kind of grep or some of the explanations people have been giving.
Yeah, it would be great to get that recent comment from Micah up on the screen. It looks like he says a couple of tools, including an upcoming release of the Snyk command line tool, will perform bytecode checks for Log4j less than 2.16.0, which is awesome. So shameless plug, but if you aren't using Snyk, which is a free developer service you can use to plug into your applications to scan for issues like this and notify you when things happen and help fix those issues, you should absolutely go sign up, snyk.io, sign up for free, plug it in, use the Snyk CLI tool, etc., to help catch some of those things a little bit earlier. Also, maybe this is a good time to mention this, but a lot of developers out there are working on applications and they're not really thinking about security. Before I ever got into the security community, like, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago, something like that, that was absolutely me 1,000,000%. Like, I'd be building web applications. It's really fun. And there's always a million things to worry about outside of security, as all of us know, right? I think when massive events like this crop up, which are impacting everybody's quality of life in the technology sector, one of the difficult things to figure out is, like, how do you keep up to date with this stuff as a developer? How do you know when things are impacting you? Are there tools you should use? Are there websites you should be like reading every day? It's obviously really difficult to keep up with news in general, but maybe each of you could go through and just make a couple suggestions for people watching the stream of what are some things they can do to sort of stay proactive and on top of situations like this in the future, because obviously the landscape is always changing. Maybe Brian, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Martijn, and finally Anna.
All right, I'll go quick. So I think keeping all your dependencies updated is using a tool to do it, right? I know Snyk has tools, but they're just whatever you have to do, keep your dependencies updated. And I think don't assume that non-security libraries aren't going to be affected by these types of problems, right? I think one of the misconceptions is that Log4j is not a security library, right? So why would you have to worry about these things? And the developers of Log4j, right? Like, so if a logging framework can be affected by these types of things, then any other library may have similar issues. So security is important everywhere.
Martijn, how about you? What advice do you have?
Yeah, we talk a lot about securing your supply chain, making sure you know exactly where the bits that you're getting, where you're getting it from, making sure you've got escrow down to where the source comes from, and making sure that you're checking the checksums, etc. of all of that, and really putting more effort. I mean, we just need to grow up as an industry, right? The industry needs to grow up and realize, hey, we can't stick on old versions of Log4j1 even and things like this, and people using the business excuse of, oh, it's too expensive to upgrade, etc. We're just going to have to change as an industry, and I think it is going to take almost a generational change in terms of teaching developers to start thinking about security from the ground up. A little bit like how we all learned to do test-driven development, and that's evolved in itself. It's also like Agile, which has also evolved in itself. But those are now kind of standard parts of the industry, and I think we need to start right back at high school and university and just start teaching, the fundamentals of, hey, if you're going to go talk to a network machine, you need to sanitize how you're talking to it. You need to make sure that you can only do the minimally scoped thing to anything that's in a distributed system. And it's, because techniques and tactical stuff will change on almost a weekly basis, and you can follow all the blogs and use OWASP and all these kind of tools to help you out. But it's really about the way you think. And, I, like you, Randall, when I first started my career, wouldn't have had the faintest clue, right? Build a web app, add stuff into a user form. Don't worry about sanitizing that input. Look at me, I created Spring Pet Clinic, and everything's fine. So yeah, that's what we need to go change.
And Anna, how about you? What advice can you offer to our budding Java developers watching this stream right now?
About security. Fun fact, I did learn about security as a developer. Actually, I learned in university, but it doesn't happen maybe to everybody to learn about security and how to make your application secure. However, at my first job, I did, when I had my code reviewed, the seniors did point out some security things that I missed and forgot. Well, junior at that time. However, nowadays we benefit from so many vulnerability advisors. Some of them are built in from the vendors, from different cloud providers. We need to make use of those. Secondly, when we're building the container images, use some trusted registries, like trusted sources, to build those containers. Do not randomly pick up something just because it gives you the smallest, base image. Because if you're like inspecting that small thing, you will see that some things are being taken out. And I know some examples from several years ago when some small images, also involving Java, were like circling the internet and were very popular, but they were excluding a few important things to be so small. So always look into, it's difficult to keep up with everything as a developer. But if you find difficult to look into these things, always have a good collaboration with your colleagues that are actually focusing on security. And also from memories, there's always a set of tests before, going into production that you need to pass, and you can get not only for Log4j, but you can also get like a description of what you can address for your application before seeing the things live. I know it's annoying to come back sometimes to rework things based on those, but it's better to be safe than sorry, as I mentioned earlier. So there are ways to mitigate things, but there will always appear these kind of situations, like the case of Log4j, where we just need to react fast. That's pretty much it from my side.
So I know we only have about 8 minutes left on the live stream before all of us have to go back to our insane jobs of fixing these exact same security issues in production applications and like helping other people fix these issues and stuff like that. So I was hoping for the last few minutes we could sort of talk about what are some things anyone watching the stream can do today to just sort of help improve the state of the security ecosystem in general in the Java landscape. Like, I feel like a lot of the time when stuff like this comes up, maybe it's just me, but one of the first things that comes to my mind is, man, it really seems like every few years there's some massive security vulnerability that comes out that severely impacts like the entire world essentially. And honestly, it sucks, And I think part of the reason that it sucks so much is that you just don't know what you don't know a lot of the time, right? Like, people don't know about all these security vulnerabilities before they happen. Obviously, like, things are disclosed and discovered and, progress happens over time. But I guess what are things that community members can do today to make the situation better? So maybe we'll start with you, Martijn, and then we'll go through the group.
I think people can help with the component governance side of things, and making sure that every project they themselves run and the projects they're involved in are kept up to date. Right, and people tend to use a lot of open source, for example, but they don't contribute back, say, a very simple Maven or Gradle patch, say, hey, I've helped you bump your thing, as an example. Now, I know we've got Dependabot and Snyk and a whole bunch of other tooling to help, but having a human actively modeling the right security behaviors is really helpful. And then I think the other thing is actually almost goes down to peer review, right? Offering to be that at arm's length reviewer, both architecturally and code-wise, for somebody else when they submit a pull request, either internally or again at an open source project, and putting on that slightly gray hat as a pretend attacker and saying, hey, how might I go about trying to exploit this? And there are common, I won't list them all here, but there are some websites out there that lists good common questions to ask in security code reviews and things that you can check for. So I've got a person internally at Microsoft now, Java group, who we joke is Mr. Tinfoil Hat. But having someone at arm's length who isn't necessarily a domain expert in what you're coding, but coming along and saying, okay, how would I break this is really invaluable.
I think, that's amazing advice. Just getting people to keep things up to date and really get involved in any projects that they're working on and trying to just sort of push that stuff forward. I think that's awesome. Anna, how about you? What advice do you have?
Well, in addition to what Martijn has said, which was very, very well and would be taken into account, it's a very important aspect of contributing. You can also contribute by sharing solutions when these kind of vulnerabilities occur. So it's not just about being a regular contributor to an open source project, but when you see these things happening, jump in with your own research, with your own cases, so that the people would know. It doesn't matter. So there's another thing that people are like kind of worrying when sharing what they tried and did. Like maybe it's not the right thing, and there will be like I don't know, somebody's gonna say, yeah, you're wrong. But it's better to get the feedback that you were wrong and to see another use case than, you know, just keeping a silence and not getting involved. And another thing that kind of fixed the issue with around Log4j, was the fact that people reacted. And it's not just the Java champions, it's not just the maintainers, it was everyone who reacted to offer a fix for this. And this is what we should keep going and doing as an entire community. That's it from my side.
I think that's also fantastic advice. And Brian, what advice do you have?
Well, I think the other two covered everything, but Anna was actually the first person that I've heard who actually had any kind of security training in college. So I think we really need. I think Martijn mentioned this earlier. We really need to go back and we need to teach these things. We need to teach people how to report a vulnerability, how to handle them, why it's important. You know, the basics, right? So as you go forward in your career, you can just build upon those as opposed to not even thinking about them at all.
I'll add one thing from my own experience. Again, not as a Java developer, but this is very true, I would say, for any of you that are Python, JavaScript developers, etc. But a couple suggestions I would have just in general about like how do you like help contribute to the security community is it's really fun if you get into it. I would say, like all of us on this call, I would say like generally would say nod your head in disagreement if you disagree with me, but generally I think we'd all agree security is really fun once you know some of the basics. And you know, if you're a developer working on stuff, like it is really enjoyable when you start to learn a little bit, and you don't need to know that much to make a difference or make a positive impact. I know for me, when I've been building things in the past, one of the things I found really useful personally is when I'm building an application and I'm going to include a dependency, I'll just do a little bit of background research on that dependency first to see like, you know, when was this thing last updated? If it was updated like 5 years ago and I'm about to plug it into my code base, like, okay, that's a bit of a red flag. Like maybe I should just think, hey, a lot of things in here are probably out of date. There could potentially be a lot of security issues, etc. Or maybe I'm looking at it and it's active, but there's a million open GitHub issues and they're all saying, hey, this thing needs to be updated, or like, hey, there's this problem here, there's a problem there. So I would just say generally like checking on the health of the packages you include too can sometimes be useful. I don't know if there's any discussion any of you have around that topic either, but it feels like there just in general, like maybe staying on top of it isn't the right word, but what I'm trying to say is like, how do we just be a little more analytical sometimes about including things? And I guess, does that help our security posture?
Absolutely. I think sorry, Anna. Martijn mentioned, you know, be aware where you get your bits. I know it was really popular for a while to just include random Maven repositories, right? Don't do those things. You know, trusted sources are sort of, that's step number one. So sorry, go ahead, Anna.
Okay, so what I was going to say is, again, you're not alone, hopefully, and your research is actually backed up as a team culture, as a team thing, and it's not just you yourself researching for a specific library. But again, it starts with each individual to be conscious about what they're using in terms of dependency, but it also strays to the entire team because you kind of need consensus when you're adopting something. So that's my take.
Awesome. So I know we're just about at time. One thing I do want to mention, we'll put a link on the stream, but we do have a remediation cheat sheet down below. We're going to pop it up in a second here. If you are watching the stream and you have not addressed the Log4shell vulnerability yet, please go check out this quick cheat sheet. It will help you do exactly what you need to do to get this resolved at your company, your organization. So please do that. Secondly, I want to thank all of you watching the stream. You're super amazing for caring about this stuff and then for taking action to like do something positive. So kudos to you. And finally, I just want to thank all of you on the panel for being here. Like you're all super amazing. Like Martijn, Anna, Brian, thank you all so much for being here. I will go to each of you real quick. If our audience wants to follow your work, ask you questions, follow up with you about anything, maybe you could just quickly say, how can people get in touch with you? And any final words you want to give a shout out to. So Martijn, we'll start with you.
Sure. So quick final words are, we're in day 7 or 8 of this right now, and human nature will tell you that people are starting to get burnt out and fading over this whole exercise. So please don't forget the human element of this. Be very kind and empathetic with your colleagues and coworkers, and also with yourself. And this is going to be, a bit of a marathon. It's not a sprint. So, please plan out your work and your mitigations and your teammates' health accordingly. For folks who want to follow me, I'm on Twitter. My handle is spelled a little bit unusually. It's Kariana, so it's Karianna. And yeah, you can get hold of me there, and all my contact details are through there. Thanks.
Thank you. And Anna, how about you?
Oh, I'm also on Twitter. So my Twitter handler is AMMBRA. It's in 1508. I didn't put it in my name today. Forgot about that. However, I'm replying to the topics that are, important to me and also for the community. And people can always find me because I have a very long last name, and typically that's how people find me. Thanks to my last name.
Thanks. And Brian, how about you? If people want to get a hold of you, where should they hit you up?
Yeah, so I'm at Brian Demers on Twitter, so that's probably the easiest bet. And I also want to throw out one last thing. So even if you've already patched all your systems, make sure you go back, and if you were affected by the issue, you need to assume secrets or whatever has leaked away from your system. So you need to go rotate all your secrets, or just assume that they've been leaked and rotate them just for sanity's sake.
I think it's a great shout out. So thank you everyone for joining. You're all super amazing. Have a really nice holiday week since we're leading into the holidays here, and take care. Adios.
Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Be safe. Bye.